everybody. Hello to our webinar, translation webinar. I'd like to welcome you all. In fact, this is another episode of a series of webinars organized by the College of Arts and Applied Sciences at the Dhofar University. In this regard, I'd like to thank Dr. Khalid Al-Mashikhi, Dean of the College of Arts and Applied Sciences, Dr. Vijay Thakur, the Assistant Dean, and also I'd like to thank Dr. Abdurrahman Saleh, the Chairperson of the Department of English Language and Literature, for his unlimited support to our translation webinar today. The webinar today is entitled The Impact and Implications of the COVID-19 Response on Translation and Translating. It's well known that COVID-19 pandemic has big effects on all aspects of life, including translation and the translation industry. Okay, so our webinar will be talking about this aspect in today with our distinguished guests. I'd like to welcome them all for being with us and for accepting our invitation. I'd like to welcome Dr. Abdul Jabbar Al-Sharafi, Dr. Lamis Omar, and Ms. Fatma Al-Ajmi for joining us. We'll start with Dr. Lamis Omar. Dr. Lamis Omar is actually an assistant professor. She is currently an assistant professor of translation studies at the Department of English Language and Literature, College of Arts and Applied Sciences, Dhofar University. She holds MSc in English, Arabic translation and interpreting from Heriot-Watt University, the UK, and a PhD in translation studies from Durham University in the UK. She is also a translator. She translated a number of books, including the Arabic, the English, the translation of these books into Arabic. بعيدا عما تعتقد دليل محير حول الدماغ 2017 تأليف مايكل ماديا وآخرون دار النشر الرياض العبيكان للنشر. The other book تغيير التعليم العالي تطور التعلم والتدريس 2010 تأليف بول أشوين ترجمة دكتورة لميس عمر في الرياض.
I start now, Dr. Yasser? Dr. Yasser, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. I just gave introduction to, yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Can I start now?
Yeah, Dr. Lamis, the floor is yours. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, dear colleague. For a start, I would like to join Dr. Yasser by extending my deep gratitude and thanks to the top administration of Dhofar University with its deanship and the English language and literature department. And I would also like to thank our dear guests, Dr. Abdul Jabbar Al-Ashrafi and Ms. Fatima Al-Ajami for joining us in this webinar, which I think, and I hope, it will bring some new light on the sensitivity of translation during crisis. My topic today is going to deal with the implications of and the impact of translating conceptual metaphors that are related to COVID-19 during the crisis. I will approach my topic from the perspective of the cognitive metaphor theory or conceptual metaphor theory. Before I start, I would like to give you a very brief idea about the nature of conceptual metaphor theory. Conceptual metaphor theory is based on a number of principles which consider metaphor to be very important as a tool for reasoning and for thinking and conceptualization of our experiences and our life. Of course, this view has always been there. It's not a new perspective of metaphor. There's a very famous quotation by the famous linguist and translator Umberto Eco. He said that the most ingenious of Aristotle's conclusion is that metaphor is above all a tool of cognition and reasoning. This view was, brought again to light by a number of linguists and philosophers, including George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, Mark Turner, and then it was developed later on by others. Very quick review of the main principles of conceptual metaphor theory is that metaphors are there, they permeate our thinking and our conceptual system. We live by them and we find them in all fields of knowledge, including science, social sciences, any field of literature. They are not limited to literature only or stylistic uses of language. And also, metaphor is considered as a mother trope. What do I mean by a mother trope? Under the tenets of the conceptual metaphor theory, metaphor works as a framework for all other types of tropes and figures of speech, be it we are talking about proverbs, idioms, lexicalized metaphors, similes, symbols, so on and so forth. Let me give you some examples of these from Shakespeare's literature. If we take, for example, the concept of time in Macbeth, I will give you two or three examples of how we have different types of metaphor, simile, metonymy, symbols, and how they all, under the conceptual metaphor theory, are encapsulated under one conceptual metaphor. In Macbeth, at the beginning, the protagonist says, "To beguile the time, look like the time." And then throughout the play, as the events progress, he also depicts the time as an enemy, and he says, "Time, thou anticipates my dread exploits." And then towards the end of the play, in one of his soliloquies, Macbeth says, "Tomorrow, tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, till the last syllable of recorded time, and yesterday lights the fool's way to dusty death." So all these are, one of them is metonymy, the other is personification, another one is simile. All of these could be organized under the conceptual metaphor of time is a human being. Now, because metaphor helps us understand concepts in different ways, it plays a very important role in categorization. And this role in categorization is what makes metaphor a sensitive tool of thought that we need to pay attention to. This was dwelled upon by a number of writers, and mainly in George Lakoff's Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. And later on, it was also dwelled upon by Professor Andreas Moself, who talked about scenarios and image schemas, and how metaphor plays a very important role in the evolution of our thinking and how it eventually leaves a perpetual impact on our actions and reactions. So metaphor is a powerful tool. Now, the case study that I have picked to examine in relation to the COVID-19 crisis is the militarized metaphors. If you examine the literature in world Englishes, whether in media, mainstream media, or traditional media, you will notice that these outlets and even speeches by important personalities are rife with conceptual metaphors, and mainly the conceptual metaphor which sees the virus as an enemy or disease as an enemy. And this is, by the way, a very classical metaphor. This is not new to our thought, but it has very dangerous, deep implications on our thinking and eventually on our actions. I have unlimited examples from the media, from the speeches of officials on how they use the metaphor of the war. For example, they talked about it as a battle, as an enemy. They described the people who work for the health system as soldiers. And we also, as people people as soldiers who need to subscribe to this metaphor. So I'm not going to go through all these examples, but eventually you will see with me that these metaphors are not merely words. They started to be reflected in images. If you can see with me here, we have a poster that was used in World War I, and it was used in World War II, sorry, and it was used to boost the morale of workers. The interesting thing that this same poster was invigorated and brought to life again. And as you can see here, we can see a nurse flexing her muscles as though she was going to enter into this war. So images like these are the result of conceptual metaphors that see the virus as an enemy. And these images, unfortunately, started to replace images like joining hands and cooperating together. And, you know, people started to pay attention to their impact. And recently there have been many research studies and articles about these in English language, not in Arabic language. Now, these quotations I did not go through because they are, as I said, unlimited. But a very interesting quotation is a quotation that was made by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who himself, you know, although he represents an international organization, a neutral organization, unknowingly, I can say he used the war metaphor and saying, we are at war with a virus and not winning it. I will tell you later why I chose this quotation, because later on you will see that the discourse of the United Nations Secretary General is going to change. So the most dangerous type of metaphors, those that come from authoritative people. On this slide, for example, we can see also an unlimited number of metaphors. One of them is by the WHO Director General, you know, the personality which represents the World Health Organization, talking about we being in war with a virus, and this virus is going to tear us apart. Sorry. Now, if we come to the implications of the war metaphor, why is this war metaphor sensitive? Why do we, as translators and as maybe linguists and as practitioners, need to pay attention to it? The war metaphor, when we say that the virus is an enemy, this does not mean only that COVID is the only enemy. Sometimes this virus is qualified. The United States president, for example, described it as being the China virus, and also the New York mayor. And this also implies that the healthcare staff turned into warriors, and that we have traitors and deserters. And guess what? The deserters and the traitors happen to be people, normal people, who break the rules. So this metaphor has led to an intense state of dichotomy and polarization, not only between different countries of the world, but also inside some countries. So we can see, for example, the World Health Organization is an enemy for the people and for the countries. We can see, you know, big urban cities an enemy of small rural areas, you know, the national people against the refugees, the nationals, you know, versus the expatriates, so on and so forth. So other parts of, you know, the risks that using this metaphor involve is that this metaphor leads to ostracization and stigmatization of the community. And I will show you examples from our real life on these later on. This metaphor also makes us appeal to fear rather than, for example, cooperation, because it instills fear in us. And we all know that when you instill fear in somebody and you want to educate them, you know that all the metaphor, the rhetoric about COVID, so on and so forth, aims at educating the people, aims at helping the people. But this fear, what it does is that it triggers cognitive dissonance. So it encourages people to disobey rather than obey. I will show you some examples from real life. For example, you can see this Syrian young man. He was shot dead by the police because he refused to stop for routine inspection. As you can see here, we have the famous actress Hayat al-Fahd. We all know her notorious statement when she said, if it were to her, then she would throw those expatriates in the desert. And also, this is one of the posts I came across on Facebook 2 days ago. This is a Syrian nurse who contracted the virus. In this post, she's complaining, she's criticizing the media, the people, because she has been subject to bullying and she has been even threatened. And even the village where she comes from also has been stigmatized and ostracized. All right. So also we have different, calls that warn against the use of these metaphors. As you can see, we start to see posters that warn against domestic violence. As you can see here, also the United Nations organization expects that about 31 million gender-based violence cases are going to emerge very soon. I don't know whether they linked it to the war metaphor or not, but this is all I know about it. I was listening to a BBC Radio 4 discussion 2 days ago, and one of the guests who's a thinker talked about how this COVID-19 crisis has led to a state of monologue. And he described the 21st century as a result of this epidemic as the age of monologue. You know what this reminded me? This reminded me of Shakespeare's monologues and soliloquies in his tragedies. In Hamlet, for example, we all remember that when he said the famous, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler to face the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them." So we all know that this state of monologue, even in Macbeth, for example, when he makes his soliloquy, that in that soliloquy, when he wants to assassinate the king, and he said, "Is this a dagger I see in front of me? The handle towards my hand. Come, let me clutch thee." And then after that, he goes to commit his crime. So all these tragic characters were in a state of monologue, sorry, not dialogue. They were, agitated. They were suffering from, feelings of hatred, of animosity. Now, the interesting thing here now is if we come back to our friend, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, just a few weeks ago, he made a very strong statement in which he called for global action in order to squash this tsunami of hatred in speech and in discourse that has arisen as a result of the COVID crisis. Little did he know that the metaphors that he himself used, contributed greatly to that. Now, what does this have to do with translation? One of the famous translators, I think her name was Anna Rusconi, said that words travel worlds and translators do the driving. So unfortunately, all these metaphors we will see later on reflected and translated literally on mainstream, on social media outlets in different Arab countries. And of course, because, people out of their maybe loyalty or accuracy or principle, and then they become to be circulated again by the people, and, then they start to spread like wildfire in large cities. تنتشر انتشار الهشيم في النار. I'm not going to go through the examples. Most of these examples that you see in front of you are translations of articles, of speeches, and sometimes of texts that were made by high-level, high-profile officials, and that use the war metaphor. Now, what are the challenges of translating this type of metaphor, the war metaphor? First of all, we don't have any cognitive challenges if we want to approach it from the point of view of cognitive metaphor theory. Why? Because this metaphor that sees disease as a war, or that sees the COVID as a war, is a universal metaphor that travels easily across different languages. Because, according to Lakoff, Turner, and Johnson, over 80 or maybe sometimes 90% of our metaphors are universal. So the problem here is not cognitive. The problem is pragmatic. These metaphors carry with them pragmatic force. They are laden with the pragmatic meaning, so much so that they started to reflect on our behavior. The second challenge is that these metaphors should respond to the needs, and discourse in general should respond to the needs of community, including marginalized groups. That's why we should deal with them sensitively. Now you may come and tell me, what about literature? Literature is full of violent metaphors, of killing. Even in literature and Shakespeare, in world literature in general, you will see this metaphor of disease as were permeating. Then let me do a very brief comparison between translating violent metaphors in literature and translating violent metaphors in the educational field in general, or in books of science and history. I will come across the two examples of Muhammad Amin Abdullah al-Bastaki. He's the pioneer of Omani translators, Sheikh al-Mutarjimin al-Omaniyin, and Kamil Kilani, who is the pioneer of children literature. We all know that Kamil Kilani introduced Shakespeare to the age group of children, because he translated the tragedies of Shakespeare to address the minds of the children. And he did that very successfully. The interesting thing is that both al-Bastaki and al-Kilani shared something in common. They both adopted a target text-oriented approach, the global translation strategy, which focuses on the target, because they have, a certain scopus in mind. So both of them were paying attention to the readership. So Bastaki was paying attention to the Omani readership, and Kilani was paying attention to the children. But there's a great difference between how they translated violent metaphors, or let's say racist metaphors, in the case of al-Bastaki. Kamil al-Kilani adapted every single thing in the tragedies of Shakespeare. He even introduced new components to reflect the style, to encourage the children, but he kept these violent metaphors. Why did he do it? And he was successful. Now you have an argument, and you may tell me, why did he do it? He shouldn't have done it if metaphor travels and if metaphor has pragmatic force. Simply because he was translating literature. We all know that in literature we have the concept of crime and punishment, and we have, these moral lessons are being communicated very clearly. We all know that, and that evil at the end is punished, and violence leads to violence or breeds violence, and eventually we have a moral lesson. But when al-Bastaki, for example, translated metaphors of racism, which were introduced, in the book of Thomas Bertram, whether I am talking about Arabia Felix or whether I'm talking about Alarms and Excursions in Arabia, which was written by Thomas Bertram in the 1930s to address a certain historical period when there was some turbulence here in Dhofar and Salalah. What al-Bastaki did, he dropped all these metaphors. He dropped them completely. Why did he do it? Simply, I can tell you very easily, because he was translating history. He was not translating literature. So he may have thought of himself as playing a role in educating the people. He didn't want to educate the people, during a time of harmony. Al-Bastaki translated in the 80s, when Oman was living in an area of peace, harmony, and people love each other, and we don't want any more turbulence. And his translation were published by the Ministry of Culture and Heritage. So that's why there's a difference between when you translate literature and when you translate the types, like for example, the COVID-19 metaphors. They are very important because they are used as part of a discourse to convince the people and to help them obey rather than to instill fear of them. So that's why I can say always, the meter that measures the quality of translation, and I think Dr. Abdel Jabbar will talk about the quality of translation today, is normally the invisibility of the translator, Lawrence Venuti's principle, and the accuracy of translation. But when these metaphors are laden with pragmatic force, when they are dangerous, then I don't think that accuracy is the meter of assessing these translation. Now, I want to come towards a model of translating metaphors. So if we can't delete them, I'm not with deletion. If we cannot translate them literally, what can we do about them? In my PhD research that I conducted on translation of creative metaphor in Shakespeare, I talked about the tendency of some writers to filter these metaphors, try to filter them, or maybe tone them down. Or we have another alternative, metaphor is a double-edged weapon, which you can use to for good purposes or for bad purposes. It's creative. So since metaphor is creative, so we can use this device, we can come up with new metaphors and replace the war metaphor. So for example, we can use the metaphor of a journey, which was introduced by George Lakoff and which was examined by Lakoff and Johnson. We can replace it with other metaphors like long long distance running. We can replace it with a metaphor of child development. Yeah, this is how we can describe it. And we have possibilities of translating these metaphors. One of the metaphors that I like to describe COVID-19 is education. It's a journey of education. Why don't we work on educating these people? An award-winning author and activist called this pandemic a portal that takes you from one era into the other. I was also following up on, the coverage of COVID of Oman, in Omani media outlets, and I was highly impressed by one of the metaphors that replaced the COVID metaphor, which is turning war into, instead of war, talking about a crisis. Why not? I used to translate with United Nations delegations, and I always remember whenever we were talking about the Syrian war, United Nations officials would say, "This is not a war, this is a crisis. Try to talk objectively." And then the other side, the Syrian side, would say, "No, this is a war. This is a war against the people." So if United Nations officials know very well what are the implications of war, why is it that they don't, give instructions or guidelines to their own translators to try to tone down these metaphors so that they try to, make the rhetoric appealing for the people? These are different images that were the end result of the COVID-19 metaphor. I'm almost finished. Sorry, I know I took much of your time. This is the, educational metaphor that I talked about. We all know that the ideal teacher is the teacher who inspires his students, who instills hope on them rather than fear. So why don't we just use the same metaphor to instill love instead of, hatred, and to instill hope instead of fear? And the final example I would like to conclude with is Plato's cave allegory. We all know the metaphor of Plato, the tunnel and the light at the end of the tunnel. We all know that this is a metaphor for reaching recognition and knowledge. Plato said that only by understanding and recognizing that our own reality may not be that of others, that we can exit the cave and see the light. So if we can do that in philosophy, I wonder why it is that we cannot do it in translating metaphor. Our realities should not reflect the realities of others, and this applies to metaphors. Our metaphors do not have necessarily to reflect the metaphors of others. So that's why I call upon all United Nations organizations. I call upon FIT, which is the International Federation for Translators and Interpreters, NGOs, societies, media outlets, translators, educators, to try to raise awareness about this issue, and try also to unfetter the hands of translators who are always, to blame, under the title of accuracy and translator invisibility. Thank you very much for your good attention. I know I took much of your time, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lamis, for this insightful presentation, this well-grounded knowledge. It's really an interesting topic, and it's a constructive contribution. Thank you very much. I want to invite our dear audience on YouTube stream to share with us their comments and questions. But please, when you write the question, write the name of the speaker to whom you would like to direct the question. Okay. Now, our second speaker is Ms. Fatma Al-Ajmi. Okay. She is an MA student in Translation Studies at Sultan Qaboos University. She completed her BA in Translation from Sultan Qaboos University, and she works as translator for Sultan Qaboos University Administration. She has translated a history book from English into Arabic entitled Amstelveen, and the book was published in Beirut, and it talks about a Dutch ship which sank near Oman's coast in 1763. Now I invite Ms. Fatma Al-Ajmi to start her talk. The floor is yours. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you today. So I will talk about the role of translation in Oman's handling coronavirus crisis. And I'll talk particularly about the case of Oman versus COVID-19 campaign, because I am part of the translation team of this campaign. So before I start, I will talk briefly about the translation in crises, the previous studies that discussed or talked about translation in crises. And then I'll move on to the translation and coronavirus crisis management, the efforts of the sultanates on social media, on its social media platforms of different social media accounts of the competent authorities. Then I will introduce the campaign of Oman versus COVID-19, then the translation team and my experience, the challenges I faced, and how we as a team were able to overcome these challenges. And then I will discuss some aspects of the problem of translating creative social media awareness messages and the proper or the best translation strategies that we have to adopt it, or we adopted in translating some of them. So let's first start with the research on translation in crises. First of all, one of the first scholars who combined the concept of crisis and the concept of translation together to form what we call the crisis translation is Sharon O'Brien. She combined these two concepts together in order to form the concept of crisis translation, and she defines the crisis translation as the translation process that occurs. I think I cannot see the full screen. Okay. Sorry for this. Okay, so she defines crisis translation as the translation process that occurs during different types of crises, including disasters, humanitarian crises, conflicts, as well as health crises. Now, generally, there's few research that talked about crisis translation. Not much research conducted on this aspect, but the studies that discussed crisis translation give more attention to the oral translation than the written translation. This is maybe because most of these studies focus on the like situations of conflicts, of wars, in which the oral communication is more than the written communication. And also they focus on the minority languages more than like the translation between two pairs of languages, or analyzing the translation strategies between these two languages. So the focus was on because we have different communities with different multilingual societies in which we have different languages, different dialects. So they focus on this particular aspect, and they think that the international organizations neglected those languages and focuses on the official languages of the countries, because we find cases in which those citizens cannot, for example, cannot understand fully the official language of their country. They can understand more their own dialects, their own language. The other focus of some of these studies is the importance of having training programs for translators, because, you know, we're talking about emergency situations in which the translator has to have certain skills, has to acquire certain skills, and has to maintain both the speed and the quality of translation at the same time. So these studies calls upon having training programs for translators. And actually one of these studies was conducted by Dr. Khalid al-Shahari, and he was part of the English department at Sultan Qaboos University previously. So he conducted a study in which he interviewed volunteer translators, Yemeni volunteer translators, who did not specialize in, who were not specialized in translation. They were specialized in English and in any other specializations. sometimes in some of the cases, because of the lack of translation background, translation strategies background, those translators were not able to render the exact meaning to international organizations. So he calls for having a systematic training programs for those translators. Another point is that there was a stress on implementing multilingual crisis communication plan. That's to say that translation has to be included in the crisis communication plan of any organization in crisis situation. So many researchers and many scholars calls upon that. The last point in this section is that no attention was given to online social media translation in emergency situations, because, you know, the translation in social media has different characteristics, different features, different strategies that the translators have to adopt. So this is basically and briefly the previous translation or the previous studies that discuss the crisis translation. Now I'll move on to the Sultanate's efforts on social media platforms. Actually, the different concerned authorities now started to have their own social media accounts in which they publish the most important news and information with regard their like different issues. But when it comes, or when we talk about the coronavirus crisis, most of these concerned authorities were active on social media, and they have like different content, different types of content, which was translated into different languages, not only English. One of these, or some of these institutions are the Ministry of Health, Oman Government Center, represented by Oman versus COVID-19, or which is called now Oman to Recovery campaign, and also the Royal Omani Police. Now, these three social media accounts were very active during, and still they are active during, the coronavirus crisis, publishing different types of statements, notices, awareness messages translated into different languages. Now, interestingly, the translation of this content was gradual, because at the beginning of the crisis, when they published their content, it was like they were kind of selective in translating some of the text. So not all the texts were translated, but they gradually started to translate those texts, and they were very selective in translating them. That's to say, they look at the audience. For example, we have certain texts that are directed only for Omanis or for the speakers of Arabic only, but in other cases we have texts that can be directed to other audience, like, for example, the non-speakers of Arabic who live in the Sultanate. So they were selective. Some of the texts were translated, and others were not. And as I mentioned, the translation wasn't in many languages, considering the multilingualism of the Omani society, including not only English, not only Bengali, Urdu, and those languages, but also the local languages like the Shuhri language, the Jabbali language in Dhofar, the Baluchi, and like different local dialects or languages spoken here in the Sultanate. The translation received positive interactions from the citizens and also residents, because those posters, those announcements and notices were shared not only on social media platforms, but also like via WhatsApp, via any other platforms. So it received very positive interactions. Now here, some pictures from these social accounts. Here, the account of the Ministry of Health, where we have the source text and the translation. The translation is into English, and here we have the translation into Bengali, into Urdu language. Here, the account of ROP, Royal Omani Police, a text translated into English. Yeah. So here specifically, I'll talk about Oman versus COVID-19 or Oman to Recovery campaign because I'm part of the translation team of this campaign. This is a media campaign run by the media team of Oman Government Center at the Secretariat General of the Council of Ministers in Oman. It started in 2020 through creating social media accounts. Particularly, it started at the beginning of the spread of the virus in the Sultanate. So that's about I think in March 2020. It posts the latest updates, news, statements, notices, and health awareness content related to the novel coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. It aims at keep Omani citizens and residents updated to the all local news related to the health crisis and raise the awareness of those citizens of the importance of following the precautionary measures and procedures. Now, the Twitter account of Oman versus COVID-19 campaign, which is now called Oman to Recovery, has 126,000 followers until now. Here, a picture of the account. The translation team consists of 7 translators, and they are volunteers working in different government institutions. They have different educational background. We have 3 of them, 3 or 4 are of translation program. They are graduates from the translation program, and we have others with the English education and international relations as well as business program. So we have like translators from different backgrounds. Here, for my experience, I'll talk about the positive sides and then, or the things that I have learned, and then about the challenges and how we as a team were able to overcome these challenges. First of all, the most interesting point is that we were dealing with various types of text at the same time. So sometimes you translate to media text, and then you move on to a legal text, to a commercial text, to a technical text, persuasive, creative text. So sometimes in one day you can translate all these types of text. So you have to change your mood from like focusing on translating a media text, and then you have to change your focus because now you're dealing with a different type of text. It's legal, so it has different like features, different translation strategies that will be adopted. So this was very interesting, and it was very beneficial, especially that you're working under pressure. So you have to submit the translation in like as quickly as possible. Get used to work under pressure. This is another point also, because you have to maintain speed and quality. As I mentioned, you have to be accurate in your translation, faithful, and at the same time you have to provide, you have to be quick, in submitting the translation. Text of different complexity. Sometimes you have a short time, but you have a complex text that needs more time than the time that's given to you. So you have to work very hard, and you have to take this into consideration. Sometimes you have a text that you look at the beginning that it's very easy, but it's not actually easy when you want to render it into English, because you have to think of the structural problems, and also you have to think about the audience you're talking to. So this is very interesting. Actually, it teaches you how to work very hard on such complex texts. Initiate new translations, because sometimes we have, like, for example, a new committee that has been established to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So you have to provide your own translation for this committee, because we have the Arabic name for the committee, but you don't have the English. So you have to provide the translation that will be then used by others, other institutions, by people in their announcements, in their notices. So you have to be careful in providing this translation. I will talk about this in details in the next slides. Cooperation between translators, revision process, because working in this translation team teaches you to be cooperative, to cooperate with other translators, to learn and to benefit from them, because during the translation process, we translate For example, if I translate, then another translator revises my translation, so the translation undergoes the revision process before being submitted. Of course, we cannot achieve this in all the time. It depends on the time, it depends on the situation, if we have time or not. Now the challenges, managing between your job and the voluntary work, because as I mentioned, it's a voluntary work. So we have our own job and we have also this voluntary work. We have to manage between the two, especially that most of the translations needed are actually in the morning, in the time of work. So it was sometimes difficult to manage between your job and the work, but as the time goes, we were able to divide the work, and to sometimes whenever we have like a break, we just translate. The translation style, this actually happens particularly in the translation of the conferences, because in this particular situation, you have to provide many translations in a very short time, and we have translations or texts that will be published as tweets and others that will be published as posters. So in this case, we have different translators with different backgrounds, with different translation style. If, for example, one translator is asked to translate a tweet, and then the other translator is asked to translate a poster, then the poster is put under the tweet. So you will have the same content. Part of the content is put on the tweet, and the poster of course have the whole content. So you will have different styles. The translator who translates the tweet has different style than the translator who translated the poster itself. So you will find the same information translated differently. So this was actually confusing at the beginning, especially for the readers. They will have different structure, different style. So we managed this and we solved this problem by trying as much as possible and asking the media team of Oman Government Center to give the same translators the same tweet and the same poster. So if we have a tweet and a poster, these tweets and posters are given to the same translators so that the translation can be the same and the style can be the same. No time for revision because we work under pressure in some of the cases. Time is short, so you don't have time to revise sometimes. So maybe you will find some mistakes here and there because of the time. Translation of news bulletins, these are oral, so you have to be less formal in translating them. You have, for example, some translation strategies are different when you're translating an oral text, like cohesive devices, conjunctions, repetitive structures or repetitive words. You are allowed sometimes to repeat because it's oral. So we took this, it was difficult at the beginning, but then we took this in mind and we were able to translate it the way they asked for. Now, another point here is relay translation. We translate these bulletins into English, and then these translated or these translated versions of the bulletins are again translated into other languages. That's to say, the media team send these translation to the translators of other languages like Urdu, Shahri, Jabali, Bengali, and other languages. So here we have to be very careful. We have to be accurate in our translation because it's not the version, it's not the source text, it's actually translation. And those translators of other languages will depend on our translation to provide their translations. So we try our best to be like more faithful and to provide an accurate translation. Another point is translation of wilayats and villages, and here I have example. For example, the translation of matrah. We have different spellings for the translation. Matrah, mutrah, matrah with one T and mutrah with one T. So we have like about four or maybe more than one translation. And unfortunately, it's not fixed. you can have different institutions have different translations for these names. So it was at the beginning, you can find one translator use the first choice, the other use the second choice, and so forth. So different choices in one text sometimes, because sometimes we deal with big documents in which we divide the translation to those translators. So you can have different spellings for one word, which is not healthy and not proper translation. So we agreed, and we agreed to use one and actually we depend on a list of spellings provided by the media team themselves. So they provided us with a list of the adopted spelling of these wilayats, and I think they took it from the Ministry of Interior. But again, for us, if we use, for example, the first spelling, for other institutions, they might also have other choices, and at the end it's not fixed translation. The same applies for the villages of ولاية مسقط, for example, Al-Jissa, Al-Khairan, Yankit, Al-Takiya, and even I'm not sure of my pronunciation, if it's true. How about translating them into English? So because these are villages, and it's difficult to provide a fixed translation for these villages. So we just translated them the way we pronounce them. The same applies for As-Suwaiq, As-Sib. So we have two different translations, As-Suwaiq and As-Suwaiq. We opted for the second one because this is the one adopted by the media team and by the Ministry of Interior, but also the first translation, for example, As-Sib, As-Sib with the AS, is also used in other institutions. The translation of wilayat itself, we have wilayat barka, the transliteration of the Arabic word wilaya, but we also have wilaya of barka. So we have different translation of wilayat of the word wilaya. We adopted the first one, wilayat barka, but again, it's not fixed when we talk like generally about other institutions when they came across such a text or such a word. So also the committee, as I said before, اللجنة العليا المكلفة ببحث آلية التعامل مع التطورات الناتجة عن انتشار فيروس كورونا COVID-19. The name is too long in Arabic, but this is acceptable in Arabic because Arabic built on this long names. But of course, English is economic. It prefers to be economic, short sentences, short equivalences. So we have different choices to translate the name of the committee. Here are some of them: the Supreme Committee dealing with COVID-19, the Supreme Committee for dealing with COVID-19, the Supreme Committee, sorry, here committee is missing, on dealing with COVID-19, the Supreme Committee concerned with the developments resulting from the spread of coronavirus, COVID-19. Of course, for the translation number 4, it's very literal translation, and it was suggested at the beginning, but it was not it was not preferable by many of the translators. So we stick on translation number 2, the Supreme Committee for dealing with COVID-19, but of course we can come up with another translation, but we just wanted to initiate one translation in which we can use it for the rest of the text where we will be dealing with in the future, to have consistency in the translation and not to each time to have different names by different translators. So we stick on number 2, the translation number 2. Sometimes when we are given big documents that have different sections, we divide the translation between the translators. So each translator has a different translation choice, different translation like structure, style, and so forth. So for the reader, they might like feel there's inconsistency in the translation, in the style, in the choice of the equivalence itself. So that's why we wanted to relatively have smooth translation, like that can be smooth and read as if it was translated by one translator. So we provided our own COVID-19 glossary, and here I'm presenting some of these words in the glossary. Like, for example, virus corona, whenever we come across the words or the term virus corona, we translate it as coronavirus COVID-19 with this way, so that it's almost fixed in many cases. الحالات الجديدة, new confirmed cases, طريقة انتقال العدوى, mode of transmission of infection, التباعد الاجتماعي, social distancing, because there were like some debates about whether to translate it as physical distancing or social distancing. So we just preferred social distancing. نقاط التحكم والسيطرة, controls and checkpoints, التنقل بين المحافظات, movement between governorates, تفشي الوبائي, epidemic outbreak, تقليل من المخاطر, mitigate the risks. So here only some words of the glossary, and the main of it is to provide like consistency in translation. Actually, some of the content in the platforms in the Oman versus COVID-19 platform were creative texts that were not translated into English because of the time, you know, because we're talking about emergency situation in which you don't have the time to translate every single content, every single poster on this account. So they were not translated, but I believe they were very important. They can have many effects. I mean, they can have a big effect on the audience. So they have to be translated. That's why, as part of my research with Dr. Abdul Jabbar, actually, I analyzed these posters, and according to Leo Heike's pragmatic concept or notion of perlocutionary equivalence, and I chose some of these posters, and after analyzing them, I suggested some translation. But here, because of the time limitation, I'll just talk about briefly and quickly about two of them. Here we have one of them. It says قدام بيتكم جنية ما نشوفها لكنها تاخذ أرواح الناس اللي نحبهم اسمها كورونا. So here they're utilizing the cultural tradition here we have in Oman at the 15th of Ramadan. We call it Qaranqasho, in which the children goes out dressing like beautiful dresses and go from one home to another, singing the song that says قرنقشو يوناس عطونا شوية حلوى دوس دوس في المندوس حارة حارة في السحارة. And when they are not giving the sweet or the thing that they asked for, they say قدام بيتكم صينية صينية قدام بيتكم جنية. So here they use this metaphor or this concept to represent coronavirus as the jinn. So here the coronavirus is represented as the jinn, that's included in those children's song. So ما نشوفها لكن تاخذ أرواح الناس اللي نحبهم اسمها corona. So this jinni's name is corona. Now when it comes to translation, because we're translating to a different audience, we have non-speakers of English here. We have non-speakers of English, and we have also different cultures. So we don't have only, for example, English people. We have also Indians. We have Bengalis. They constitute a big percentage of the Omani population. So we're targeting different cultures. So when we translate this, in order to maintain the same effect, in order to, because the purpose of this is to request audience to stay at home and not to go out in order to protect themselves and others from coronavirus. So we have to take this into consideration while translation, and we have to take into consideration also the target audience. Therefore, here I provided, I mean, of course, let's agree that we cannot use literal translation in this case because it would not give the same effect. So here I provided two translations actually. One of them is imagining that, or if we are directing this text to English people, then we can utilize the Halloween festival, because this is one of the cultural festivals they have there. They have special celebrations for children, which is called trick or treating. Actually, it's similar to Qaranqasho, because children go from home from their home, visiting others' home, asking for a sweet. And when they are not giving what they asked for, they sing and they say trick or treat. Here, treat is the sweet, and a trick refers to reacting badly if they are not giving what they asked for. So this my suggested translation was coronavirus or COVID-19. So it means that you don't have any other choice. If you allow your children to go out and to visit homes, those homes asking for a sweet, the virus will transmit to you and to those inside your home and to everybody. So you don't have any choice, coronavirus or COVID-19. In those cases, you will catch the virus. So it's the same as the structure of trick or treating. So this is the translation I provided. Now, if we talk about another type of audience, Indians or Bengalis residents here in Oman, we can talk about Holi festival, in which the individuals in this festival put colors, different colors in their faces. So I thought of utilizing this in my translation. So I followed we call it the recontextualization strategy. So I translated it this way: the beautiful colors in your face may turn to a deadly green color. So here, referring first to the concept of putting the color, different colors in your face as part of the like festival features or traditions. And also the green color is because coronavirus is distinguished in media by the green color. So in order to maintain the same effect in the translation. The second poster, يستاهل عقوبة كل من ألف إشاعة مكتوبة. Here you find the rhythm. We have عقوبة and مكتوبة. So this is beautifully written, and you have to maintain this, and you have to render this beautiful structure into the target audience, because otherwise it will be like as any other poster. If I choose translating it literally, I would say deserve a punishment all those who write rumors. So it would be like it's dull, has no like creative sense. So the audience will not be interacted with it as the same way as if I translated it creatively, maintaining the same effect. So here I suggested the translation to be: if you write a sentence, you could be sentenced. So here you have a sentence representing writing or spreading a rumor, and then you could be sentenced, so you could be punished. And of course, here the poster will include people spreading writing in their phones. So the same picture we have here. So the poster will include those people spreading rumors. So it will be clear when you write. If you write a sentence, you will be sentenced. So here it will be clear that this the sentence I'm referring to is actually the rumor. So this is the suggested translation. Now, generally, there are a lot of others posters, creative posters, beautiful ones that if they were translated into English, I think they will provide like a positive effect to the target audience. But I just chose these two because of the time. But also, one question while I was working on this translation, one of the questions that came to my mind is, what if the translator cooperates with a marketer in order to provide the translation? Because not every translator has the ability, has the skill to translate creatively. Sometimes you have to get the help of the marketer, because he have the marketing and promotion maybe skills. So that's why I thought of kind of a cooperation between a marketer and translators in order to provide creative translation. So that's it. And here are the references. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Fatma. I'd like to thank you for this fruitful talk, for this good information, comprehensive survey of translation activities and strategies. Thank you very much. And due to time limitation, I'll immediately go to Dr. Abdel Jabbar, our third speaker, Dr. Abdel Jabbar Sharafi. Okay. He is an assistant professor of linguistics and translation studies at the Department of English Language and Literature, Sultan Qaboos University. He also served as chair of the English Language and Literature Department. Dr. Sharfi holds an MA and PhD from Durham University, the UK. He has attended international conferences and published in peer-reviewed journals. So, Dr. Abdul Jabbar, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me upload my my presentation. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Dhofar University and Dr. Lamis in particular for their kind invitation. And I would like to welcome the audience to my talk. I'll be talking about translation quality assessment during COVID-19, and I will be sort of advocating translators and interpreters in my presentation. So people may expect that I will be talking about translation quality assessment. I will be harsh on translators and interpreters. On the contrary, I'm actually advocating their existence, and I'm valuing their contribution, especially in this difficult time. In my presentation, I'll be talking about, I'll of course provide definitions of certain terms, and then I'll talk about two major translation quality assessment approaches, and then I'll talk about typology of translation errors, and I'll talk about two major translation orientations, and then I'll talk about the error tolerance, the threshold, different thresholds of error tolerance, and I will also share with you some of the data that I've been looking at in terms of translation quality assessment, and then probably I'll move on to my conclusions. So what is quality? Quality is when a product or service meets the expectations of a user. What is translation quality? When a translation product or service satisfies the end user. What is translation quality assessment? The process that ensures a translation product or service meets the expectations of a customer or end user and makes them satisfied with the product or service. And what is emergency? A situation that poses a threat to people's safety or health and requires an urgent intervention. Okay. Emergency situation. COVID-19 pandemic is an emergency that no one was prepared for. Governments, health organizations, economies, social and religious systems, all were not prepared for this. It has created a situation that necessarily required the dissemination of enormous multilingual information globally and at the local levels, all within emergency conditions. National and international media centers and information centers were created to take sole responsibility of developing relevant information and disseminating it to people in many different languages through translation and interpreting. Okay. Now, this has created a dilemma, in my opinion. This dilemma is the fact that we have to maintain quality in the time of a crisis or in the time of an emergency. So this emergency situation and the urgent need for mass translation and interpreting has created a dilemma, which is how to maintain quality in a state of emergency and urgency. Okay, so two major approaches of translation quality assessment. The first one I call static approaches to translation quality assessment. And the second one is the dynamic approaches to translation quality assessment. Static approaches to translation quality assessment are essentially linguistic approaches. They are equivalence-based models, those of NIDA, Vinay and Bernay, Newmark, Collar, and you name it. All these models which seek equivalence are static models because they look at the translation from a fidelity, from a faithfulness perspective, regardless of any contextual considerations. Also, another set of approaches is the functional models proposed by Katharina Rice and Juliana House and Hans Vermeer. Although they are functional models, they are actually still equivalence-based, and they are still static approaches because the notion of function is different in each model. For example, in Rice, Katharina Rice's model, function here is textual function, whether the text is informative or expressive or operative. In Juliana House's model, function means the semantic, pragmatic combination of or dimension of a text. For Vermeer, I think the notion of function, according to Hans Vermeer, Scopus theory probably is the first attempt to view the notion of function from a professional, industrial perspective, in which the issue of translation brief and the purpose of the translation is has come to the forefront of discussions of quality and evaluation. So these static, rigid, and fixed models do not really give due consideration for key factors such as content type. And here I'm not talking about text type, I'm talking about content type. So there is a difference usually between a tweet, a translation of a tweet, and a translation of a prescription of a medicine. There is a difference between translation of a video or a written text. Also, they give less consideration to context, to mode of translation, whether it is human or machine, or human-assisted machine translation or machine-assisted human translation. There is less consideration also on communicative purpose and also audience, the end user requirements. The second set of approaches is the dynamic approaches to translation quality assessment. These respond to contextual variables, particularly emergency factors such as the ones related to COVID-19 pandemic. Examples, the multi-dimensional quality metrics and the dynamic quality framework and business intelligence. These actually respond to issues of urgency, issues of translation flow, issues of crowdsourcing, freelancing, volunteering, and community translation. Urgency, the World Health Organization is a major source of information on COVID-19, and there is huge need for localization and mass translation and probably also mass interpreting. Website translation, leaflets, brochures, manuals, and caregiving guides, public notices, public signs, social media material, all these require translation across languages to suit particular communities and societies. Translation of very urgent healthcare material, translation of highly sensitive health material related to the pandemic. Normally, the translation of such medical texts is very highly regulated. Example, medicine prescriptions. Translation quality assessment of such material is highly rigorous and seeks highest level of clarity. Here, there is this, the dilemma again comes up because high level of clarity, high level of factual accuracy, but also less time. And this is what creates the dilemma. We need to translate more, but we have less time. And also, many of the translators and interpreters are volunteers who don't have enough experience or don't have enough training. As part of the SDL response to COVID-19 pandemic, they have offered machine translation free of charge for health science professionals, which is a contribution from the industry. Those of you who are familiar with the SDL is a global language services company. It's the company that runs Trados as a memory tool, translation memory tool, and other language services. As far as emergency is concerned, we talk about remote interpreting, remote translation. If it is remote interpreting, then the interpreter lacks access to facial expressions. There is absence of body language. There is absence of physical experience. The interpreter translates from a remote distance. So the big picture also is missing. Only what the camera allows the interpreter to see. So there are all these logistical issues that influence the output of the interpreter or the translator for that matter. Sometimes there is a problem with internet connection, voice clarity, and there is also this issue of stress, because especially in medical situations where the doctor is trying to convey a highly emotional, highly sensitive message to the patient. For example, giving the patient the phone to call the family and asking the patient to say goodbye to the family because they cannot see him, because he's about to die because of COVID-19. This actually puts the translator or the interpreter in a very stressful situation to convey the message to the patient. And we need to bear all of these issues when we assess the quality of translation. Two major orientations in translation: overt translation, source-oriented. It looks like a translation, it reads like a translation, it sounds like a translation, or a covert translation. It is target-oriented, it reads like an original, it sounds like an original. But of course, there is always this continuum. These two orientations actually represent the two ends of a continuum, but in the middle, you can also think of other types of either closely related to overt or closely related or oriented towards the covert. Typology of translation errors. Of course, there are three types of errors. The critical error is the one that has major effects, not only on meaning, but also on the product usability, company liability, consumer health, safety, and behavior. So if there is a mistake in the translation that poses some kind of threat or risk to the user, then it's a critical error. These have negative impact on meaning, but not, of course, on the health and safety of the user. Minor are noticeable, but don't have a negative impact on meaning and will not confuse or mislead the reader. So I have some quickly data here I want to go over and probably relate them to this error typology. Here you can see a text translated more probably from Arabic. I'm not sure, but it looks that it's a translation from Arabic. Here we have لمرضى ارتفاع ضغط الدم, احرص, etc., etc. The title in English, to patients with raised blood pressure. Of course, you know, talking about the genre, the medical genre, I think it would be better to say patients with high blood pressure, or patients with hyper blood pressure, or at least patients with increased blood pressure. But raised is semantically odd. However, I think this is, in my opinion, this is a minor error because it does not really affect meaning. It does not pose any threat or risk on the user. Another example here is from the preventive measures for shopping malls. Number 8. Here I'm really confused. I don't know which is the source, which is the target. But from the appearance of it, it seems that the English is the source and the Arabic is the target. I think in number 8, the mall will send a circular with the contact details of a company at competitive prices in case the retailers want to avail their services at their own expense, and they shall submit serialization reports to the mall's management periodically. First, there is a minor error here. The fact that the Arabic sentence begins with sofa, of course, here will does not mean future. So I think the Arabic should just start with يرسل المركز التجاري تعميم. So sofa here is a minor error in my opinion. But if you look at the entire clause or in the entire article, it is quite ambiguous, because the Arabic says سوف يرسل المركز التجاري تعميم مع تفاصيل الاتصال بهذه الشركة, and there is no mention of a sharika before. So even though in the English it is details of a company, this created some kind of vagueness. It is quite ambiguous. Yes, it's some kind of vagueness to in the translation. Another example is number 12. Okay. Prayer halls will remain closed until further notice by the Supreme Committee. In the Arabic, again, we have the sa, the future particle sa, and I think it's a minor error here. The Arabic should have been just تظل قاعة الصلاة مغلقة. There is no need for the sa, because here we are not, and this is a common error, by the way, many translators actually make. Number 14, the mall management will carry out routine inspection inside the retail stores. Again, the same thing. ستقوم إدارة المركز التجاري. In fact, this should have been تقوم إدارة المركز. There is no, and these are all minor errors. In 16, however, the English says control points shall be placed inside the mall to monitor the customers' wearing of face masks. Control points, Fatma mentioned that control points يعني نقاط التحكم أو السيطرة, but here in the translation it says يجب وضع نقاط ارتكاز داخل المركز. This lexical choice I think created some confusion and some vagueness, because what is نقاط ارتكاز? I think نقاط التحكم والسيطرة, نقاط مراقبة would have been much better in this regard. Observations. Translations are generally, as you can may have noticed, translations are generally overt. They are source-oriented. There is no cultural filter applied. And I think it's okay because these are informative texts. Therefore, clarity is the most important priority, and there is no need to adapt. There's also need to maintain the equivalence. So the translations are the fact that they are overt is not a bad idea, actually. Most of the errors are minor. Sometimes it is difficult to determine the source and target text. In the data, there are only 2 errors that can be categorized as major. You know, the نقض الارتكاز and the ambiguity in that previous statement. No critical error was found. The error tolerance in normal situations, a threshold of 4 minor errors per 1,000 words. Many translation companies give this kind of threshold. They would tolerate 4 minor errors per 1,000 words. And they also tolerate 1 major error per 1,000 words. There is zero tolerance for any critical error. Translation is rejected, and translator is blacklisted sometimes because it poses threat and safety issues on the end user, especially in translating health and safety literature. Conclusions. Appreciate more and blame less. You know, especially in these circumstances, we should appreciate the translators and interpreters' work more, and also blame less, because we know that translation is done under urgent emergency situations, and many of these translators are not trained. They are volunteers, they are freelancers, you know, community members. So we should appreciate more, blame less, critique more, but criticize less. Collaborate in developing and conveying relevant multilingual information about this virus. We should also realize that translators and interpreters are equally valuable and vulnerable. They are important for our life, just as medical doctors and nurses are. We should also know that much of this translation is done through freelancing, crowdsourcing, volunteering, and community translation and interpreting. Translation quality assessment should be flexible, dynamic, and responsive to the urgency and criticality of the current global situation. We should engage community not only to develop and disseminate information about COVID-19 within their communities, in their local languages, but also we should engage the community to also give feedback on translation, to assess translations, to evaluate translation, and share their feedback to concerned authorities. Integrate remote and online translation quality assessment in such an emergency situation, so that we don't pose the life of translators and interpreters to any risk. we need to strike a balance between urgency and quality. We need to adopt dynamic models of translation quality assessment and move away from the equivalence-based or the static models. There is a need for a communicative and context-oriented framework to determine the translation error typology, not a purely linguistic one. Pay attention to the human and psychological dimensions of the translator-interpreter and the translation interpretation landscape. Engage communities in facilitating information transfer during this pandemic. Engage communities as end users in assessing the quality of translation. I was looking in Google for something like a word of thanks for translators and interpreters, and I typed thank you coronavirus helpers, and I got this image from Google, and I checked if there is any icon or any reference or any mention of translators and interpreters, and I unfortunately failed to find any reference or any mention. And I even asked Fatma to check with me, and she also confirmed that there is no mention of a translator or interpreter, which is somehow quite disappointing, because they are there in the front lines, in hospitals, in doing their job, doing their best to convey and disseminate multilingual information about the virus. However, I found this somehow reassuring and gratifying message about translators and interpreters. This is from the International Association of Conference Interpreters. Protect translators, protect interpreters, you protect the world. And that's the end of my talk, and these are the list of references. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Jabbar, for this insightful presentation, this encyclopedic knowledge. Thank you very much. Now I may go quickly to the question and answer sessions, and I'm sure I'll come back to you for some questions. For Dr. Lamis, there is a question from Dr. Abdurrahman Saleh. My question to Dr. Abdurrahman Saleh's question to Dr. Lamis Omar. Which function of metaphor you consider prevalent in the context of the COVID-19? Can you hear me, Dr. Lamis?
Yes, I can hear you. Do you want me to answer right away, or do you prefer to give me all the questions and then I answer them in one go?
Okay, this is a question, another question from Dr. Nizar. Do you think Shakespeare's well-known humorous insults in his plays can constitute a corpus for metaphor analysis after translation? Okay. Also, another question by Dr. also Nizar. Are there any other types of metaphor than war metaphor that George Lakoff and Stephen Cohen spotlighted in their contributions to CMA, critical metaphor analysis and translation? So these are to Dr. Lamis, questions to Dr. Lamis.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for asking these highly important questions. Dr. Abdurrahman, mainly the COVID-19 metaphors carry out two main functions. The first function is the cognitive function of metaphor, not only the COVID-19 metaphors, but of conceptual metaphor in general, which is to instruct and to inform the people, because, you know, this is the main role of metaphor in language and thought, as was, explained by a number of linguists and philosophers. So, for example, I have just, remembered one of the metaphors that are used on BBC, stations, radio stations, TV, which is the metaphor of shielding. This is also inspired by the militarized logic or the militarized metaphor. Shielding is a concept that has been developed recently to mean protecting the vulnerable. protecting the elderly, protecting pregnant women, you know, all these people who, if they contract the disease, they are at risk. This metaphor was used to inform the people that, listen, these vulnerable are people that we should protect, we should take care of them. All right. Again, this metaphor also used the war rhetoric. All right. And the other function of metaphor is to convince the readers, and this function has always been there. You know, المجاز أم اللغة. You know, in all languages, across all cultures, metaphor has been used by, you know, people who use rhetoric, by linguists, by philosophers, by influential bodies, in order to convince the people, to appeal to their minds, because it has a powerful, as I said, pragmatic force. So that's why when I said that metaphorizing, if metaphorizing the discourse involves militarizing the content, then the results are going to miss the target. They are going to be counterproductive, and they are going to be destructive rather than instructive. The second question by Dr. Nizar. Thank you, Dr. Nizar, very much for your insightful question. In fact, definitely metaphor, or analyzing a metaphor in getting a better understanding of humorous insults by Shakespeare is extremely helpful. I will explain why this is important. Metaphor, as I explained later, is laden with pragmatic force. Irony is highly pragmatic, is an indirect expressive meaning which is full of pragmatism. And in order to produce irony, in fact, my MA was on translation of irony. So to produce irony, we need the component of surprise. We need to flout the maxims of Paul Grice, all right? The maxims of quality, quantity, relevance, so on and so forth. Most of Shakespeare metaphors that, or most, insults and humorous insults by Shakespeare were built in metaphors. For example, in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Shakespeare says she has more wit than her. And also a very interesting example of a humorous insult is when Shakespeare says in As You Like It, your brain is as dry as the remainder of a biscuit. What Shakespeare did very wittingly, even 400 years before Paul Grice, is he flouted the maxim of relevance and of quality by changing the conceptual metaphor of normally we use the conceptual metaphor is body as a delicious food, or as something delicious to eat. Now what Shakespeare did, he turned the brain into a delicious thing to eat. Okay, so he flouted relevance. It came as very surprising, and he flouted also the maxim of quantity. That's why it was, it had the element of surprise, which we need when we come up with ironic language, and it created, these witty insults. So yes, Dr. Nizar, that's a very, very interesting subject for researching the role of metaphor in producing irony. The third question, what was the third question about? It was by Dr. Nizar, I think.
Yeah, the third question
is other types. Yeah, I remember now. It was on the
other types of metaphor.
Yes, definitely. George Jacob and Mark Johnson and others introduce very interesting, countless examples of conceptual metaphors. Not only the metaphor of the war. For example, they did not only associate the metaphor of war with, disease. They also talked about argument as war. They dwelled so very much on the metaphor of love as a journey, time as a river. These common metaphor, because what they were trying to do is to show that these metaphors, we use them in our everyday life, not only in science, not only in literature, and that they permeate our thinking, and we live by these metaphors. So yes, definitely. And also we have Professor Andreas Mossoff, who built on these metaphors when he has been always, he has a long, lifelong project analyzing the metaphor of the body politic, how the Nazi regime made use of the body politic metaphor to practice persecution, injustice against the innocent people. I hope I answered all the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lamis. Because of shortage of time, I have some questions to Ms. Fatma. a question from Dr. Julius. Is there any official or authorized translation society or campaign to support the Oman government, especially to deal with social media messages or information?
As far as I know, no, there's no official like campaign or association, but they have their own translators. For example, if we talk about different concerned authorities, they have their own translators. They have their own job, so they work as translators in those institutions or in those authorities. And some of the institutions depend on volunteer translators, but as like an official ones, I don't think so.
Okay, another question from Dr. Nizar to Ms. Fatma. Do websites, especially social media, use translation software or hire translators, or maybe both?
Sorry, for the...
do websites, especially social media, use translation software or hire translators, or maybe both?
For the website, if he talks about institutions and their accounts, I didn't understand the question. So he talks about the institutions in their social media platforms?
In their social media, yes.
Yeah. So I don't know about others, but for us as a team, we translate without using any CAT tools, for example, but we depend on machine translation, of course, in the translation process itself, but not as a whole, in like searching for certain terminologies and certain words, yes. But as depending fully on CAT tools or machine translation, for us, no. For other institutions, I have no idea, actually.
Okay. Dr. Abdel Jabbar, you have talked about, yes, this is my question to Dr. Abdel Jabbar. You have talked about the quality of translation and translation errors, okay? How do you classify translation shifts? Are they errors and do they influence quality?
I think translation shifts are not necessarily errors. They are translation strategies. Some of them are obligatory shifts and some of them are optional, but in general, translation shifts are translation strategies. They make lead to some translation errors, but in general, they are not errors.
Okay, a question from Dr. Abdulrahman Saleh to Dr. Abdel Jabbar. How can we assure accuracy and the quality of translation when the focus is on communicative function of translation?
I think this issue was raised by Dr. Lamis and also by Ms. Fatma as well. We need to maintain accuracy, but not necessarily linguistic accuracy. I think in factual accuracy and information accuracy is more important than linguistic accuracy in this particular situation. We should not like hold translators responsible for all types of linguistic inadequacies, I would call them, because they, if the meaning is not affected, then they are minor, and we should be tolerant.
Okay. Just have a question to Dr. Lamis. My question: you are calling upon the translators to introduce shifts to the source text metaphors. To what degree do you think they are responsible for metaphors they themselves didn't create?
Of course, they are responsible for these metaphors, because metaphor in particular is different from any type of content that we create for two purposes. First, because these metaphors are used, as I said, not for the purpose of entertainment. They are not used in art. They are not used in literature. They are used as part of an official worldwide campaign in order to convince the people and to inform them and to instruct them. So they are extremely dangerous. Translators are the vehicles. Just let us think of translators as a shipment company. All right, if this translator, let's think of him or her as a shipment company. Do shipment companies ship anything without checking on the content? I think that translators are equally responsible, just like authors, in filtering or for filtering these metaphors. You know why? Because according to descriptive translation studies, Gideon Thury and the others, a translator is an author. A translator recreates. So he or she is equally responsible for the content or that they are processing. That's my answer to you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank all our distinguished speakers today. Dr. Lamis Omar, Assistant Professor of Translation Studies at the Far University, College of Arts and Applied Sciences, Department of English Language Literature. Dr. Abdel Jabbar Sharafi, okay, Assistant Professor of Linguistics and Translation Studies at the Department of English Language and Literature, Sultan Qaboos University. And also I'd like to thank Ms. Fatma Al-Ajmi. She is an MS student in Translation Studies at Sultan Qaboos University and also a translator. I'd like to thank you all. Thank you very much for being with us. Okay, as we can see that the translator has a great role to play in the current situation that we have. Okay, just maybe the sound. These things normally happen. The translator has a great role to play in the current situation. Translators are working around the clock in order to overcome the current situation, and medical translators are doing their best in this context. At the end, I just want to thank you all, and I'd like to thank the Far University administration for organizing a number of webinars, including our translation webinar. I thank them all for their efforts and continuous support. And also I thank the chairperson of English Language Literature Department, Dr. Abdurrahman Saleh, for his efforts, our Dean, Dr. Khalid Al-Mashikhi, and Assistant Dean, Dr. Vijay Thakur, for all their efforts and continuous support. And I wish to meet you in other webinars and conferences, inshallah. Thank you very much, and wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Jabbar. Thank you, Dr. Lamis. Thank you, Ms. Fatma. Thank you very much for your contributions. And it has been a great pleasure and honor to have you with us in our webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.